Growing up in Baghdad through the Iran-Iraq War and the First Gulf War, Dunya Mikhail began writing war poetry as a teenager. Mikhail thought of herself as a poet first in high school. She then continued writing in college and published her first book. She wrote for a newspaper in Iraq using symbolism throughout her works because literature was heavily monitored by the Iraqi government. Through her poetry, Dunya Mikhail takes the role of being a voice for the Iranians who could not speak out against the government. Mikhail speaks from the woman's point of view when addressing war and the role of women in general in Iraq. Historically, Iraqi women and girls have had relatively more rights than many of their counterparts in the Middle East. Contrary to many people's opinions, Iraqi women had far more freedoms under Saddam Hussein's government than women in other Middle Eastern countries. Drafted in 1970, the Iraqi Provisional Constitution established women's equality. Iraqi women played an active role in the political and economic development of Iraq. Female literacy rates reached an all-time high at 87% by 1985. Women attained the right to vote and run for office in 1980. Overall, women assumed greater roles in general during the Iran-Iraq War. Since the 1991 Gulf War, the position of women within Iraqi society has diminished greatly. Lamiz al-Tahari writes in her thesis that Dunya Mikhail challenges mainstream literature by presenting the Iraqi woman's experience of war. Far different from the male-dominated war literature written in Iraq, Mikhail portrays mothers, lovers, sisters, and daughters who protest war's brutality and injustice. Mikhail believes women and men perceive war differently, she says in a personal interview with Lamiz al-Tahari. Most of Iraqi writers are males, many of whom had been in the battlefield. For them, it was a war with other men who they had to kill or be killed by. As a woman, I could see the war in the streets, in the tears of mothers, in the eyes of birds frighted by bullets, in the holes of the walls and of the helmets of those men returning from the battlefield. Rather than glorify the war as many men do in their poems, Mikhail takes on the harsh reality of war in her poem, Bag of Bones.
The dictator does not give receipts when he takes your life. The dictator must have a heart and a skull too, a huge one, unlike any other. His skull alone has figured all this out, how to multiply one death by millions to equal the country. He is the director of this tragedy, and as his audience applauds, it shakes the bones in the bags, the full bag finally in her hand, unlike her neighbor, who still goes on looking for her bag of bones.
Bag of Bones illustrates a woman collecting her loved one's bones during war. The poem implies Saddam Hussein's injustice in war when Mikhail says, "The dictator does not give receipts when he takes your life." Mikhail uses non-traditional techniques, including sarcasm and a woman's perspective in her works to create an emotional appeal for readers. Further supporting this idea, Sadi Simmawe says, Mikhail has impressively renovated the genre of the war poem in modern Arabic poetry by boldly introducing new techniques with a new vision. Always under the watchful eye of the Iranian government, Dunya Mikhail had to be very particular with the words and phrases she placed in her poems. The Department of Censorship in Iraq had employees whose job was to watch public morals and decide what you should read and write. Therefore, Mikhail used metaphors and layers of meaning in her works. With the publication of Mikhail's second book, Diary of a Wave Outside the Sea, the Iraqi government took caution of the writer. As a result, Mikhail was consistently harassed and put on Saddam Hussein's list of enemies. In her work, Mikhail implicitly points to Saddam Hussein and his followers and the destruction they have unleashed on the country and its people when she writes, "He rounded up his followers to discuss with them the means of exterminating the human race." Though Mikhail does not directly refer to Saddam Hussein, she was still harassed and, fearing for her life, fled the country in 1995. Mikhail uses sarcasm again in her poem, The War Works Hard. The poem begins with, "How magnificent the war is, how eager and efficient." Mikhail uses this sarcasm to personify war and emphasize how destructive war really is. She mocks the influences of war and allows the reader to realize the artificiality of those who lead it.
It builds new houses for the orphans, invigorates the coffin makers, gives grave diggers a pat on the back, and paints a smile on the leader's face. The war works with unparalleled diligence, yet no one gives it a word of praise.
After fleeing Baghdad in 1995, Dunya Mikhail sought refuge first in Jordan and migrated to the United States in 1996. Mikhail found it difficult to continue writing poetry when she first arrived in the United States. But as time went on and she became more comfortable in her new environment, she enjoyed the privilege of being more direct in her poems. In an interview with Lamiz al-Tahari, Mikhail says, "In Iraq, I was using figures of speech, symbols, and a lot of layers in my writings to avoid interpretations of censors. After I left Iraq, I didn't feel the need for those symbols. My writing became more direct." More recently, in 2001, she was awarded the United Nations Human Rights Award for Freedom of Writing, and she now lives in Michigan as an Arabic instructor for Michigan State University.
People say it's exile, they call it, but really, this is for me, if I have to call it exile, then maybe I would say exile, sweet exile.